The First World War would pale into insignificance when compared with the horrors of the Second World War. The Holocaust, the killing of 6 million Jews, killing of millions of other civilians, the atrocities of the Japanese prisoner of war camps, all these were seen to have been perpetrated by three dictatorial states with their fascist ideologies. This, compared with the fact that all these three states were ultimately defeated in the Second World War, made the explanation of the war quite simple at the beginning. For more than a decade, the orthodoxy was that the three fascist states with their radical political ideologies caused the Second World War and subjected the world to untold misery and devastation. It was suggested that had Neville Chamberlain of Britain not pursued the policy of appeasement, had France been more resistant, had opinion in the USA been a little less isolationist, things might have turned out to be different. Indeed, there might not have been a war at all. This orthodoxy was supported by older historians like Sir Lewis Namier and Sir John Wheeler Bennett. They subscribed to this simple explanation. They were a little too judgmental. They, in a way, betrayed the general feeling of Germanophobia that affected most of the historians. A major breakthrough was achieved around 1961 when A.J.P. Taylor published his Origins of the Second World War. Taylor was provocative, if also a little opinionated. He felt that Hitler's aims were no different from those of other statesmen. He also went on to suggest that Munich was a triumph of all that was best and most enlightened in British life, a triumph for those who had preached equal justice between peoples, a triumph for those who had courageously denounced the harshness and short-sightedness of Versailles. Again, I am quoted from Taylor. Quite obviously, his views did not go unchallenged. Hugh Trevor Roper, who had worked with the German secret files at the end of the war, suggested that Taylor's thesis would do irreparable damage to his reputation as an historian. Trevor Roper, on the other hand, suggested that Hitler did have a concrete plan of ultimately expanding in the East and finally, at the cost of the Soviet Union, establish domination over the whole of Europe, if not later extending it to the whole of the world. So Trevor Roper, for one, was convinced of Germany's guilt, particularly of Hitler's guilt. The historians have broadly been divided into two different schools. The intentionalist school, who did believe that Hitler and the Germans must share the responsibility for causing the war. They accept that whether Hitler had a plan or not, there is no doubt that it was his dictatorial policy that was the determining factor behind the German foreign policy during the Third Reich. Alan Bullock, for example, concluded that Hitler pursued a plan of German domination of Europe by establishing a new order. He identified the overthrow of the Versailles system and the pan-German dream of dominating Europe as the two primary aims of Hitler's foreign policy. Taylor, as we have seen already, did not believe that Hitler had a plan. According to him, Hitler was a brilliant opportunist, and he even considered that the ideas expressed by Hitler in the so-called Hossbach Memorandum were nothing more than mere daydreams. Hitler had a plan. He was only waiting upon events and responded to them. But even then, Taylor did concede that Hitler had an expansionist dream in the East. It was taken up later by German historians as well. Andreas Hillgruber, for example, suggested a three-stage plan that Hitler had undertaken. It was first Europe, then the Middle East, and finally a global war with USA for world domination. Klaus Hildebrand had also talked of a Stufenplan that again is a stage-by-stage plan for expansion. For him, the stages were first Lebensraum or living space in Eastern Europe, destruction of Soviet Union in the next stage, and finally global domination. Thus, Hitler's foreign policy, according to these historians, was the outcome of his own clear personal intention, executed with a high degree of tactical flexibility and improvisation. Later, other German historians like Eberhard Jäckel and Dietrich Eigner echoed almost identical views. Jäckel argued that even a cursory glance at the diplomatic and military history of the Third Reich demonstrated that Hitler had a definite and structured list of objectives and priorities, even if he did not have a timetable or a detailed prospectus. Some German historians have even suggested that Hitler's ultimate aim was the domination of the fortress Europa to begin with, and then world domination by achieving victory first over the Soviet Union and then extending the war beyond Europe. As against this, intentionalist school was the structuralist or the functionalist school. They would argue that the policy of the Third Reich was dictated by the structure of the state and society and economy. They also further argued that policy decisions were determined by the functioning of the principal elements of that system or that structure. A number of studies have now demonstrated the polycratic nature of the German dictatorship. Now, they suggest that the Nazi system was far from a monolithic, centralized, and efficient dictatorship. It was an administrative anarchy of competing agencies. Hitler, for some, was even a weak dictator who, rather than initiating policy, responded to the pressures created by the system. That is, pressures that were created by this rather chaotic system of dictatorship and coordination that the Third Reich had been able to achieve. Hans Mommsen, for example, argued that the foreign policy of the Third Reich had no established priorities. There was no plan. He concedes that it had expansionist dynamic but no ultimate aim. Indeed, he has described the policy as expansion without object. Karl Dietrich Bracher, in his book The German Dictatorship, feels that the idea of Hitler as an all-powerful dictator is a myth which was perpetrated by Nazi propaganda. So they would tend to argue that Hitler's total control is something that was misread by historians earlier and needs to be questioned properly. Martin Brossart argued that Lebensraum was at best an ideological metaphor, essential for the sustenance of the dynamic forces released by the Nazi movement. While these people were talking of the defects in the structure of the Third Reich, this was later carried on, particularly to the economic field, by another set of historians. Tim Mason, for example, took the view that the war had begun in 1939 as the result of a domestic economic crisis in Germany in the late 1930s. His conclusion was that the forced rearmament, for example, program that Germany had undertaken intensified all the contradictions and difficulties within the system that had really left no other option open for Germany. This is true of events after 1936, when the 4-year plan was adopted and so to be executed. There were several problems threatening the economy. For example, inflation, budgetary difficulties, and the worldwide trade recession of 1937, which affected Germany's trade possibilities and hence the import of the required and absolutely essential raw materials. Because of these problems, he felt, that is, Hitler felt, that war should come sooner rather than later. Now, this view is given credence by the fact that 1.5 million foreign workers and 1.3 million prisoners of war were working in Germany as cheap labor in June 1941. Later, Ian Kershaw and Richard Overy have also suggested identical factors as the reason behind Hitler's decision to switch on the aggressive mode increasingly after 1936. Richard Overy, in his book War and Economy in the Third Reich, had examined in details the possibilities of the domestic pressure being manifest in the pursuit of a foreign policy. And rearmament is always privileged as one of the factors that produced a tremendous pressure on the domestic economy, and the rearmament was seen as an adjunct of the aggressive foreign policy and Hitler's decision to ultimately wage a war. So here also, even though the points point is that it is the difficulty of the structure or the contradiction of the structure that resulted in imbalances and led to war, the responsibility of Hitler could not be entirely negated. Another point was made later by many historians, including German historians, is a question of continuity in German foreign policy. Earlier, historians like Meinecke thought that the Nazis had no deep roots in German history. Gerhard Ritter, for example, suggested that features of Nazi foreign policy like anti-Semitism and social Darwinism were imported from outside Germany. But more recently, Taylor, for example, in The Course of German History, had earlier suggested that there was indeed a continuity in German foreign policy goals between 1871, the creation of the Second Reich, till 1945, when Germany was defeated in the Second World War. Fritz Fischer, the noted German historian who'd written about German responsibility in the First World War, had also seen this continuity in a later volume that was entitled From the Kaiserreich to the Third Reich. Here again, Fischer suggests a continuum between 1871 and the period of the Third Reich there. And historians, if we may sum up some of the points that they have suggested, would be that Lebensraum, for example, had earlier echoes in the propaganda of the Pan-German League in the 1880s and 90s. German dominance of Eastern Europe, for example, was also a clear aim of German foreign policy in the First World War. The German Fatherland Party, created during the war by the army and army veterans, had identical views and membership as that of the Nazi Party much later. Even the Weimar government between 1930 and 1933 had advocated many basic goals of Hitler's foreign policy. Hitler, in a way, represented the right-wing consensus in German society over particularly the goals and aims in foreign policy. Yet, it is to be considered that Hitler outdid all other governments in sheer wickedness, particularly in the extermination of the Jews. Jeff Ailey, another English historian, suggested that Nazism was indeed more extreme in every way. Mussolini had become close to Germany. We had seen this in an earlier lecture, that particularly after the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, Mussolini increasingly leaned towards Germany and Hitler. Yet, in 1939, he was neutral, joined the war only in 1940, after Hitler had virtually routed France. Historians have doubted whether Mussolini had any foreign policy goals at all, whether he had a very clear idea of what he wanted, apart from vague expansionism. He has been described by Max Smith, a notable historian of Italy, as a blundering boaster who lived in cloud cuckoo land and improvised his foreign policy almost daily, unquote. Recently, historians have tried to understand a kernel of policy behind Mussolini's decisions. For example, he was also thinking in terms of a living space, spazio vitali, in particularly North Africa and East Africa, and maybe in Middle East or West Asia. He also needed the foreign policy adventures as a kind of safety valve to turn away the attention of people from the domestic pressures. But ultimately, one has to concede that Mussolini or Italy was a great power, a major power in Europe only by courtesy. Italy did not have the resources and the power to really take a decisive action in European politics, not yet. He, however, kept his options open, and this is why he remained neutral in 1939, joining only in 1940 when it appeared likely that Germany would win this war. Historians have turned away from Hitler and the three fascist powers to also look at the at least negative role of the West European powers, notably France and Britain. It was first suggested by a book entitled The Guilty Men. This was written by a group of left-wing intellectuals in England under the pseudonym of Cato, and it was published as early as 1940. It viewed appeasement as a blatant surrender to the bullying of Adolf Hitler. Later, Wheeler Bennett, Kate Middlemas, Martin Gilbert and R.A.C. Parker have all worked on this aspect of international politics in Europe during the 1930s. And they, in a way, reinvented the guilty men as men who were guilty of pursuing a diplomacy of illusion. This in fact had allowed Hitler to feel encouraged. They never really resisted Hitler. Alternative policies like a positive commitment to France against German aggression, attempt to bolster the League of Nations as a real agent of collective security, of cultivating friendship with the Soviet Union had never been even seriously tried. And therefore, when war came, Britain and France were without friend. But more importantly, they were also in a weak military situation. Chamberlain was personally responsible for this policy of appeasement, as he virtually ran the foreign policy as a one-man band. France was also put under the scanner, and French policy of appeasement has been criticized as well. It was suggested that France stumbled from government to government. She had 16 coalition governments between 1932 and 1940, from crisis to crisis, and finally from peace to war. French appeasement was negative and stoical. France's defense was entirely predicated on the Maginot Line, and they had no thinking about an offensive strategy at any point of time. And in attenuation of France, only it's been said that France could hardly afford to alienate Britain and see her on the sideline in case of a war between France and Germany. But even then, the French appeasement was positive. Now, again, orthodox historiography would often put a sizable blame on the Treaty of Versailles, that the Versailles contained the seeds of the Second World War. Now, this view was first put forward in a manner of speaking by the brilliant economist J.M. Keynes. He wrote the economic consequences of the Peace of Versailles at the end of the year 1919. And in this, he argued that by keeping German economy dead, the peacemakers had decided to kill the European economy. He said that before the war, German economy and along with it European economy had been rising all the time. And now half the continent lay dead after the war and the other half was dying. In this context, he felt that the peace had become a Carthaginian peace. Instead, every effort should have been made not to alienate Germany at all. A.J.P. Taylor argued that the Treaty of Versailles lacked moral validity almost from the beginning. But again, this view has not been accepted by others. Later, Ruth Hennig, Anthony Adam Thwaite tried to suggest that they had done decent work. Probably they faced problems which could not be solved, which were very difficult to be solved. And that in the 20s, the peace worked. In 30s, it did not work because there was no enforcement. That when the terms of the treaty were violated, those who were supposed to preserve the treaty did nothing to make the treaty enforceable. And it was the violation of the treaty, violent violations by Hitler and Mussolini, that ultimately made the slide to the war unavoidable, if not inevitable. The Great Depression of 1929-30 as a real watershed. The peace worked in the 20s, but it was not workable anymore because of the Great Depression, and the blame therefore should not be apportioned to the peacemakers of 1919. The Nazi-Soviet pact provided the immediate backdrop to the Second World War. Historians have also raised an accusing finger at Stalin, that by concluding the Nazi-Soviet pact, he had relieved Hitler of the nightmare of having to fight on two fronts. But then, in support of Stalin, it was suggested that he had tried to make peace. Indeed, during the Cold War period, some American historians in particular, including Robert Tucker, suggested that the foreign policy of the Soviet Union in the 1930s deliberately wanted to drive a wedge between the capitalist powers and expected that they would be involved in a war and the Soviet Union would benefit at the end of the war and make advances in Eastern Europe. As against this, when the Soviet archives were opened after 1989, it has been seen that the Soviet Union did try to support the collective security. They entered the League in 1934. After that, wanted to cultivate collective security. They wanted to support Czechoslovakia in 1938. They had, even in early 1939, tried to make friends with Britain and France rather than with Germany, and finally concluded the pact with Germany as they did not have any option. Stalin had a sneaking suspicion that Britain and France were hell-bent in unleashing Germany and Hitler against the Soviet Union. And a final point about the American isolationism and its withdrawal from the League. It has been suggested that this made the League weak from the beginning and did not give collective security much of a chance. And also, the war in the Asia-Pacific region was also important, particularly the role of Japan as an aggressive power. But we have not looked at the Asian war at all. We have concentrated on Europe here. Now, then in conclusion, it is possible to suggest that a consensus on the origin of the Second World War and on the responsibility for the war is bound to prove elusive. It is not necessary, perhaps not even desirable, that we have a final and unanimous view. The debate goes on. But in conclusion, one is tempted to revert to the point one had made at the beginning and suggest that the primary responsibility of Hitler cannot be ignored.